Welcome everybody to the YWCA Australia ERA budget panel for 2020. Thank you so much for joining us. This is one of those strange digital moments where you can see us but we can't see you. So apologies for very strange eye contact, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to all those Melburnians who are joining us and sitting in front of their screens for yet another evening instead of going out into the wild where they actually can now. A special thanks to everybody in Melbourne for looking after us by sticking with lockdown for as long as you did, and congratulations on returning to the world. My name is Helen Fisher. I'm the Senior Manager of the Equality Rights Alliance, which is one of the two organisations that are hosting this event tonight. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that each one of us is meeting here on Aboriginal land. Where I am in Canberra, it's the land of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. And I'd also like to note that this is land that was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This event tonight is one of the latest steps in a process that began just before the budget this year, when we were attempting to get the government to start looking at the budget from a gendered point of view. The Y and ERA have a long history of working in the budget space, and it's been frustrating over those years to see a consistent pattern of failure to notice the things that women need when it comes to budgeting federally. The interesting thing this year, though, was that everybody else noticed. In a year when the COVID-19 pandemic has made it very clear that women experience economic structures differently, we saw a budget that completely failed to respond to the needs of women. And so what we're doing tonight is having a look both at the consequences of that gender failure in this year's budget, but also having a look at some of the things that you might be able to do as individuals to help us to push the government to produce a budget that actually works for you and me. I'd like to start just briefly by letting you know a little bit about YWCA and ERA. The Y is an organisation that has been with us for a very long time. I think we're up to about 165 years, something in that region, in Australia. And it's an organisation that has always been at the forefront of looking at not just the needs of young women, but it's actively supporting young women to be involved in Australia's public life and in Australia's political life and in leadership generally. And so that's why it's so great that ERA is able to partner with YWCA this year, because this is an area that's going to become increasingly important. You as young women are going to be the most important backbone that we have in pushing the agenda for agenda responsive budgeting. Meanwhile, the Equality Rights Alliance, my organisation, is one of the 6 national women's alliances. We're the Generalist Alliance. 3 of the alliances deal with populations and 2 of them deal with very specific subject areas, but we tend to deal with the crossover areas, which is why we're interested in gender responsive budgeting, because gender responsive budgeting is one of those pieces of gender equality work that underpins everything else. If we haven't got the budgeting right at federal level, then we're not going to make real gains anywhere across society. And that's particularly the case where the failure to gender budget sits in unconscious bias. That's something we'll talk a little bit about later on. I'd now like to hand over to our moderator for the evening, Kristine Ziwica. Kristine's a Melbourne-based columnist and a consultant who's a regular contributor to The Women's Gender, which is a publication we're all very fond of, The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, ABC News and The Guardian. She's got over 20 years' experience as a feminist writer and activist in a career that's taken her from New York to Munich, Berlin, to London, and now to Australia. She started a journalism career at Ms. Magazine in New York in 1997 and went on to editorial positions in New York magazines such as Travel and Leisure. She was a Burns Journalism Fellowship from the International Centre of Journalists, and she spent months in Munich working on the Weekend magazine there. She's got a long process behind her of delving into issues that relate to gender and particularly, most recently, to the way gender operates structurally within Australia. So, Kristine, I'd love to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I appreciate that. Yes, as you said, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and magazines were still in print, I started my journalism career many, many moons ago at Ms. Magazine in New York. I've had the great privilege of working in this space in a number of different countries, including in the UK, where I worked at the Equality and Human Rights Commission as their head of media and campaigns for about 7 years, which is where I think I really learned at the feet of a lot of masters and learned a lot about some of the structural issues and what underpins these and what we need to do to address them, which we will be talking about tonight. When I was asked by Bobby and Helen to host tonight, I was absolutely delighted. Obviously, this is an issue that I've personally been looking at in the lead up to the budget through a series that I've been working on for Women's Agenda about the gendered impacts of the pandemic, which has been funded by the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism. And obviously, as part of that, it became very clear that the budget was going to be a significant statement of intent about whether or not this government intended to address some of those issues, many of which were reaching crisis point. So yes, I'm really looking forward to tonight. We've got a lot of issues to explore, issues very close to my heart, and I know yours. And particularly to kind of get beyond some of those sort of headline stories that we might have read and delve a little bit deeper and look at these issues from a few intersectional and different perspectives as well. I'm really looking forward to discussing it with our expert panelists here tonight. So let me just introduce you to those panelists. We're really lucky to have Heidi La Paglia. She is a young woman with a disability working with Women with Disabilities Australia and a representative at forums, including the 2019 conference on the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We also have Emma Davidson, who is the convener of the Electoral Lobby and the 2020 elected member of the ACT Legislative Assembly. Congratulations, Emma, on your new position. And Molly Hermans, who is a social justice organizer, writer, and community worker. So just a little bit of housekeeping. There will be a Q&A after the panelists' presentations. So please do jot down any questions. We really want to make this kind of an active and engaging evening. I am one of the many who have been in stage 4 lockdown here in Melbourne for the past 4 months. So I'm delighted to virtually be with you all tonight, and I'm really looking forward to some engaging and interesting discussion. Yes, so first we have Emma. I'm going to hand over to Emma, who's going to provide us with a bit of an overview on the budget. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you. Well, look, you know, the budget is actually something I really enjoy digging into every year and have done for a long time. I'm very comfortable with going through budget paper number 2 and then comparing that to what's already been announced during the year and what funding levels were in there in last year's budget, so that we can sort of work out where are they hiding the cuts, or you know, where is there a little bit of extra funding where you know, we might want to find out a bit more about what does that actually mean. The reason why I find it so interesting is because of the impact that it has on people's everyday lives. You know, these are the things that, these are the economic decisions that impact on things like, can you afford to pay the rent? Are you going to be able to find work? Are you going to be able to afford to go and get a new qualification and make a career change? Is there going to be domestic and family violence service funding in this country? So it is really important to get stuck into it and find out what's really going on. Now, this year has been pretty hard for everyone, but in terms of unemployment, women lost more jobs and, more importantly, lost more hours of work than men in the initial stages of this COVID-19 situation in March and April. The thing about the hours lost is important because there's a lot of women who work in insecure jobs, in casual or contract employment, or in part-time employment in retail, in hospitality, in care work. And those were all industries that were really heavily impacted right from the beginning. And so that's why we saw that happen to women. Now, we have seen some rise in employment levels since, not rise in employment levels, but more so a drop in unemployment levels. But what is actually driving that is that the participation rate also dropped more for women than it did for men in the months going after April. So what that means is that a whole lot of women lost shifts or lost their jobs in March and April, realised those jobs aren't coming back anytime soon, and stopped looking for work. And part of the reason why they would have been doing that is because they all had increased responsibilities as carers for others, as there was, you know, children studying at home or unable to go to childcare, as there were, you know, elderly or family with disabilities who needed a bit more help and couldn't get access to other services to do it. And so that impacted on them. It was also impacted by the way childcare was treated for JobKeeper and for subsidised childcare, and the way in which, you know, that support for that really important care work was withdrawn by the federal government. So what we really need to be doing is valuing care work and paying carers if we want to have an impact on that. Women also have increased housing stress. You know, it's not just from the economic situation, but it's also the intensified levels of domestic and family violence that are being experienced. We know that there are a lot of people out there experiencing housing stress, just based on things like, for example, the ABS's household impact survey on COVID and looking at what people were doing when they withdrew their money from superannuation funds. Women were cleaning out their funds and they were using it to pay for survival. It's housing and it's putting food on the table. So this is not fun play money that they're taking it out for, and it's going to have a long-term impact. The growing cohort of women over 45 experiencing homelessness for the first time in their lives is very much related to women's financial security as they get older. And if you don't own a home and you don't have a lot of money in super, it's going to be very difficult. You just can't pay private rent on an age pension in this country. So we were also looking for solutions to that in this year's budget. Now, what we actually saw is that money has been taken away from social housing and homelessness. There's a $41 million drop, and that is mainly coming from no ongoing commitment to the ERA, which is basically paying social housing and homelessness workers in that sector a decent living wage. That is basically going to be left to the states to pick up, and that's going to make it very difficult to continue delivering the same levels of service if the states aren't able to come up with the extra money there, now that federal government are not going to be doing it. There's also some of the things that have been funded are things that are not particularly going to help women. So, for example, new homeowner grants, there is some money for that in the federal budget, but the difficulty is there's a huge number of women on low incomes who are renting, and they're not going to be helped by that new homeowner grant because they still can't get the rest of the deposit money together. And for some women, home ownership is actually not the solution they're looking for. What they're looking for is security of being able to pay affordable rent long-term for appropriate housing for their needs. There is an extension to the NHFIC, which basically provides loans, not grants, but loans to community housing providers to build community housing. But for example, in the ACT, community housing providers are not eligible for that funding. And so it's not necessarily going to be a solution. What we really need actually is a large number of social housing properties to be built and for specialist homelessness services to be funded properly. There's also no increase for rent assistance for people on the lowest incomes who are reliant on Centrelink payments, and that makes life very difficult. And concerningly, there is money for Indigenous Business Australia to build more housing, but it's important to know that that's a Commonwealth government corporate entity. It's not an Aboriginal controlled community housing organisation, and that's really important when we're talking about self-determination. So what we really need is to fund social housing, to increase the Commonwealth rent assistance, and to fund Aboriginal controlled community housing providers to build that housing. Another area where there could have been a lot more improvement is the Parents Next program. So there was funding in the federal budget for another 235,000 people to be put into the Parents Next program. Now, the government is selling this as support for people to get into work. The reality of Parents Next is that most of the people who are participating in the Parents Next program are women. They tend to be younger women and with young children. And what Parents Next does is a compulsory program that requires them to attend certain appointments or participate in certain programs, theoretically to get them job ready. It doesn't necessarily actually help them do that. What it does remove is a lot of flexibility in how they manage their time and take care of their family responsibilities. And studies have found that it's just not actually helping these people who really, would like some help to actually get back into good paid work. What would be better is if that system was voluntary and if it wasn't linked to their payments in a punitive way, so that if you miss an appointment, your payments get cut off. If it could have some flexibility and be voluntary, that would help enormously. And if we could fund things like the vocational education and training sector, TAFEs and CITs, to really provide some good support for women who want to transition out of work in industries like accommodation, hospitality, retail, where there just aren't as many jobs at the moment and won't be for some time, into secure, well-paid work in the long term. But I think the thing that disappointed me the most about this budget actually is the process of doing the federal budget and communicating that to the sector, the community sector this year. As with last year and the year before, the time that we had in the lockup to go through the papers was shortened. It seems to be getting shorter every year. Last year, they actually tried to keep us out. This year, they were willing to actually let us in. But it was a really disheartening process. It just feels like they're trying to keep us out and tire us out so that we stop asking for a better budget for women and for a gender lens on the policies that they're putting out there. But what we need to do is to not give up and keep on talking about what's most important to us.
Kristine, I'm just going to let you know you're on mute.
Okay, yes. Sorry, thank you for that, Emma. As you just rightly highlighted, there is a lot to unpack in that budget, and thank you for the efforts that you've made in that regard already. So I was asked to highlight to set a bit of a scene, some of the things that I've noticed in writing this series for Women's Agenda in the lead up to the budget, particularly around the gendered impacts of the pandemic. And the thing about this budget, and partly getting back to that point that Helen made about this year people noticing, is that it was a spending budget, and it's coming out in the context of the pandemic, which we've already noted tonight was disproportionately affecting women in a number of different ways. And I started out the year by writing a piece for the Sydney Morning Herald. I was asked to sort of write what was a scene setter for gender equality, what were the big issues that were going to be on the agenda in 2020. Who could have known where we would end up? But one of the things that consistently Ann Summers said to me, Kate Jenkins, and almost everyone that I spoke to, was that there really needed to be a focus on holding ground. And what happened as a result of the pandemic is that we moved to a situation where we were seriously in danger of losing ground. And when the gender pay gap figures came out this year, Libby Lyons at the Workplace Gender Equality Agency warned that we were at risk of losing a decade or more of progress on the gender pay gap. And then when you add on to that we've had probably about a decade worth of warnings about women's economic security, or more accurately put, their insecurity, and that was reaching a crisis point. Women over the age of 55 are the fastest growing portion of the homeless population. Obviously, the pandemic and the impact that that's had on women's ability to earn and their ability to save, as well as the early access to super scheme, which was negatively disproportionately affecting women, caused a lot of concern about the pandemic expediting or accelerating women's economic security at a time when we really weren't making significant progress in shoring it up. And thirdly, I think the thing that people were really looking at going into this budget was whether or not there was going to be, I guess, an ideological shift from this government in their approach to gender equality. So one of the things that I've observed over the last 7 years that I've lived and worked in Australia in this area is that there tends to be a real focus on this kind of discredited, lean-in model of fixing women. If we can just give them computer skills or, you know, a bit of mentoring and all will be right with the world. And I sort of famously did an analysis of the first Women's Economic Security Statement, which came out in 2018, and did a word search. And the word discrimination, unfortunately, only appeared 3 times, and 2 of those times were in Kate Jenkins' job title. The word choice, however, appeared 13 times. So I think in that context of the pandemic, how it was accelerating certain issues like economic insecurity, how it was, you know, losing ground on issues like the gender pay gap and women's workforce participation rates. I think that there was a heightened level of expectation that maybe this year the problem and the issue was just too big to ignore, that the pandemic had really shone a giant magnifying glass over these issues, and now is the time to act. So I think a lot of people, present company included, were watching that budget and waiting for something. And that's kind of the context of going into the budget, and perhaps why there was such a rapid, not wholly positive response in the days after it came out. So moving on, Molly, I'd love to hear your perspective, because I think that we had some initial sort of headline stories in the days about economic security, childcare was a big story. I'd love to hear from you if those types of issues resonated with you and your lived experience, or if there were other issues that you think are equally needing attention that we should look at a bit more deeply.
Of course. Thank you, Kristine. And before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge that I am joining everyone tonight from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And I pay my respects to elders, both past and present. And in particular, I want to extend my condolences to the Jabberong people who have just lost an irreplaceable part of their culture and their history. And also extend my condolences to all of the families fighting against death in custody right now. I know this week is a very big week for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. But yeah, where to begin with this budget? So as context, I work in family violence. So I work for one of the National Women's Alliances, AWAVA, Australian Women Against Violence Alliance, and I also work for Women With Disabilities Australia. So I have participated in some budget analysis regarding violence as well as the impacts on women with disabilities. And I think in particular, I'm really, really shocked that there was not any more funding announced for specialist women's services or to address rising rates of violence against women. Because, you know, this year has been filled with crises, from COVID-19 to the bushfires. And we know that this leads to a spike in violence against women and their children. And so, you know, when we see these spikes, we know that demand for frontline services serving victim survivors of violence really increases. And we know that these services are under a lot of pressure and strain. So at the beginning of the year, the government provided what was described as, I'm going to put in quotes, an initial $150 million package to respond to the increased need. So I think around 130 went to states and territory governments, and then the other 20 million went to like existing programs like 1-800-RESPECT, and yeah, those kind of programs that are already in existence. And I think the sector kind of expected that this was just an initial burst, that we're going to see more funding that's desperately needed. But instead we saw absolutely nothing in the forward estimates, which I was shocked about, given how big of a priority it should be. And I think too, like increasingly the conversation in Australia has been highlighting violence against women and how, you know, it's being labelled as the shadow pandemic. Also, there were lots of programs that didn't have funding reallocated. WWDA Safe Connections program, that is one of the most vital programs addressing tech abuse, which a lot of other kind of services don't have capacity to address, didn't receive any more funding. And then one of the other big things too is that increasingly we're starting to talk about women on temporary visas who don't have access to income support under Centrelink, and so often have no funds or means to escape violence. And yet there was like no extension of any type of income support to these women. So again, there's lots of different vulnerable communities who aren't getting any type of funding or assistance to actually address, you know, violence against women. And I think increasingly too in this sector, we're starting to realise that violence affects different women in different ways. Whether you've been Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, or like I was just explaining, a woman on a temporary visa, there are always going to be different barriers to escaping violence compared to the broader community. And the funding and resourcing just does not reflect that at all, which is really unfortunate, and means for these women that these barriers are going to keep compounding. Another huge issue too in the sector is we're working up to the second national plan to reduce violence against women and their children, and there was nothing in the forward estimates. You know, we desperately need resources to begin this work, and I think with COVID-19 and increasing kind of focus on violence against women, now is a perfect time to start actually building towards this national plan. But yeah, there's no resourcing there. So yeah, I think overall, I was really shocked that there was nothing for violence against women. And I think that this leaves the sector in a really volatile position, because I know through speaking to people who work for specialist women's services, just how much strain they're under, having to adjust to, I guess, flexible work arrangements. So supporting people from their own bedrooms, which can be incredibly traumatizing, you know, to have to do this really heavy work from your own space. And to not have capacity to support women because there's simply not the resourcing or the funding there, is a disservice not only to victim survivors who desperately need support, but to, you know, a majority workforce that's made up of women, and a lot of women too who themselves have been victim survivors. So yeah, that's incredibly frustrating. And I think to give like a broad estimate to the kind of agreed upon estimate that violence against women costs Australia every year is $21.7 billion. And so for 150 million injection and then nothing, it just like, it's piecemeal. It really doesn't compare. And I think, yeah, this kind of flows in really nicely to the lack of, I guess, support we saw for women in increasing income support for everyone. And I think I want to kind of preface this by saying that I personally believe that our current welfare system is very violent, and I think that it continues to leave people without the means to survive. And I am very critical of programs like robo-debt or different mutual obligation requirements, like Emma, you were talking about Parents Next, for example. I think that they, you know, they've been proven to contribute to Australia's suicide epidemic, especially amongst young people. And I grew up on income support. This is actually the first year of my life that I've never lived on income support. So I know how hard it is to survive on these payments. And so I don't think that there is any type of quality under these budgetary decisions until there is like a very concerted effort to wealth redistribution in our community. But yeah, to me, the standout under changes to social security and income support was establishing the cashless debit card as an ongoing program. So beforehand, cashless debit card, which is a form of welfare quarantine or welfare management, had been trialled in 5 different areas. And in particular, I want to highlight that this was in Aboriginal communities as well. So it was very much a type of welfare management that racially targeted communities, and harked, you know, back to kind of mission management days. And so this is actually, yeah, being established as an ongoing program. And this makes it impossible for people to survive, essentially, when you have your payment quarantines. Like if you're a young family, or if you're someone who has a disability and you need to look for the cheapest option because you're getting paid so little anyway. So that might be an op shop. That might be, you know, I need to take out $20 to give my kid for this excursion or the canteen or whatever. This type of welfare quarantining just doesn't let that happen. And I think increasingly too, it reinforces the stigma that already we see people living on welfare payments experience. So yeah, I think there definitely should be more anger at the establishment of the cashless debit card. Yeah, and I guess too, this leads to not only the way that these payments are being delivered to people, but the actual rates of these payments themselves. I know a lot of people were relying on some type of raise to the disability support pension, the age pension, carers pension, because with other payments earlier in the year that had received the coronavirus supplement, these payments hadn't. There'd been one-off injections of $750 here or there. And again, we didn't see a raise either. We saw two $250 injections, which leaves disabled people, in particularly disabled women, really, really vulnerable. In particular too, during COVID, when prices for things are just skyrocketing, you know, for a lot of people, they can't access protective gear, they can't access masks, they can't access hand sanitizer at reasonable rates. And if you're immunocompromised, I'm immunocompromised, I need to make sure I have these things. So yeah, the costs are just not adding up to the rates of payments people are getting. And of course too, I think I'd be remiss to not say that I was very, very disappointed to see that the rate of job seeker was not permanently increased. I think advocates from the Unemployed Workers Union, from ACOS, Raising the Rate campaign have done an incredible job trying to raise light to the fact that previous rates of New Start and job seeker just were not adequate enough. And I think it's really disappointing. And I think it's put hundreds of thousands of people in a precarious situation, to know that that payment will not be lifted. And I guess too, as a woman with disability, the other kind of focus area that I was really looking at in the budget was health. And I think a lot of people were very excited to see the expansion of mental health care sessions under GP mental health care plans extended to 20. And I think this is great. As someone who uses my mental health care plan and sometimes towards the end of the year worries, oof, do I have enough sessions? I thought that was great. But I was, again, pretty disappointed to see that there was no effort to address, I guess, the high out of cost pockets for mental health, and the fact that for a lot of people, there is just no access to any type of mental health professional or psychologist that bulk bills. And I think that it doesn't add up to me that we expend sessions, but we still don't eliminate those initial financial barriers as well. No additional funding included to implement the 2020-30 Women's Health Strategy, which I think, again, is a huge missed opportunity, especially in the context of COVID-19. Always, I believe that there's inadequate funding for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. And I think in particular, there was a really big opportunity to build upon the success of community-controlled organisations in protecting communities against COVID-19. And I know that there was a funding injection, but it just, again, was not nearly enough to meet community needs. And then I think, yeah, the final thing for me in particular, as someone who has benefited from telehealth and who has seen other disabled people in my community benefit from telehealth, was the fact that there was only a temporary extension of 116 million or 111.6 million, announced. So there's actually no clear commitment to telehealth beyond COVID. And I think that's really scary for me, because we've been talking about, how COVID-19 has kind of changed the way we interact with each other. The world is suddenly a lot more accessible, and this has been a silver lining for a lot of disabled people. But as soon as that's rolled out, it can, again, very quickly be taken away. And I think, Kristine, this kind of harks back to what you're saying about, you know, not losing ground. And I really, really fear that, you know, telehealth has been a big win for disabled people, and that if we don't fight for it to be an ongoing commitment post-pandemic, that we will lose that ground again, and that suddenly specialist appointments and healthcare will become inaccessible again. So yeah, oh,
Thank you, Molly. Thank you. Yes. It's one of the things that we'll talk about later is what we can do, and one of those questions is to sort of just find the energy, to find the wherewithal to keep going. It can be very dispiriting. A lot of the themes that I'm hearing tonight are words like pretty disappointing, missed opportunity. But how do you find the wherewithal to keep going and not only hold ground but gain ground? The inspiration to seize this opportunity. I do think that we have a wonderful opportunity at the moment, because I think compared to years past, there's a lot of momentum behind the community messaging about the ways in which the budget didn't deliver for women. And I'm really pleased that tonight we're having a more nuanced conversation with different lived experiences, including yours, Molly, because as Emma was saying, one of the reasons that she likes to go into the budget in such detail is because it affects people's lives. And you've really beautifully illustrated that today. So thank you so much for that. Next, we're going to move on to Heidi, who's going to tell us a little bit about what perhaps some of the missed opportunities were in the budget, or the disappointments from her perspective.
Sure, thank you. Hi everyone. I will first acknowledge that I am on the land of the Muanina people in Nipaluna, or otherwise Hobart, and I acknowledge the elders past and present. I guess I'm coming from a similar perspective to Marley. I do work for Women with Disabilities Australia, and I am a young woman with disability, so I have some of those very strong same views. But I will, I guess, try to make some different points. I guess I'll start with something sort of positive, which is kind of rare, I guess. But while the budget overall was disappointing for women with disability, I guess I should say that the disability sector did definitely welcome the extra funding to the NDIS and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. An extra 3.9 billion over 4 years was put into the NDIS. And that's really important. It's essential, given that the NDIS is one of our only national supports for people with disability, and it currently only covers 10% of the disability population. And within that, for women with disability, only 37% of NDIS participants are women, and of those under 14 years of age, it's under 30% that are girls compared to boys. So yeah, I mean, we really hope that that extra funding will go towards increasing the number of women and girls in the NDIS, because that's really needed. In saying that, though, it is concerning that on top of that, there was basically no clear funding allocated to the new National Disability Strategy, which is in a similar way to the Prevention of Violence Against Women strategy. It's pretty strange, given that the new National Disability Strategy begins this year, and there's going to be a new one that will cover the next decade. And I suppose in relation to the NDIS, this is really important because the NDIS doesn't have a gender lens and works quite closely with the National Disability Strategy. And I guess something that I wanted to make a point on in relation to this is that it's quite, I guess it feels quite close to me, because I am a person with disability, but I am also a woman with autism, and that the reasoning that they give for NDIS participants being so low among women is that too many boys have autism, which is not the case. In fact, there's no evidence to suggest that more boys than girls have autism, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that girls are often either undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, or even if they are diagnosed, don't receive the adequate supports because are seen as too high functioning. And I guess I've had that all my life, of course, but I was only diagnosed this year. So I guess I'm a prime example of exactly why that happens. And without a gender lens in the NDIS and in the National Disability Strategy, those gender biases are just not going to change. And I don't have a whole lot of hope that more girls that do need to be in the NDIS will get the support they need through that extra funding. I guess this is similar within the NDIS National Quality and Safeguards Commission. So the commission, the role of it is to oversee NDIS support services and to make sure that people are safeguarded from all forms of violence and abuse when they receive those services and in their general lives. But currently, the NDIS Commission is completely inadequate. In the inquiry after Anne-Marie Smith's death, which most people probably have heard about, it was found that out of 8,000 complaints against disability services across the country, only one provider received a fine and was banned from providing services. So that's 8,000 services. So I can't imagine how many individuals with disability that would be that are unsafe and that aren't being supported in that system. So essentially, again, the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission new funding is fantastic, but only if it is implemented in a way that is effective and actually increases the power of the commission and the services that it actually offers to people. In addition to the NDIS, I guess the other thing is people with disability really needed more support to participate in employment and in the community. And that's really completely lacking from the federal budget, as Marley spoke about a little bit as well. For example, the government has allocated a significant amount of money, well, not a significant amount, it has allocated some money to getting women back into the workforce and also getting young people back into the workforce. But we are pretty sure that that's not going to get, it's not going to benefit women with disability who already face so many barriers to participating in the workforce, such as discrimination and inaccessible workplaces, lack of access to higher education is another one. And on top of that, there is no support to put women with disability through workplace training or education either. And rather, there's really complete disincentives to participate. So, for example, in higher education, there was really nothing again. So higher education received money for research funding, which the universities welcomed, of course, but there's nothing at all for students. And for students with disability, I know that's particularly disappointing. So in comparison to students without disability, students with disability are much more likely to drop out of higher education or to fail their units or have to defer due to personal or health circumstances. This lack of, sorry. This situation, I suppose, combined with the changes to higher education that were recently introduced, which both increase the cost of female-dominated areas and force students it removes access to students' help debts if they fail 4 units in their first year. So that's half the units in their first year. It's basically going to mean that students with disabilities are not going to be able to get a higher education, and many already don't. So it's even further increasing those barriers. On top of this, women with disability have also been excluded from social security payments. And I know that Marley talked about this really well. And it's just very disappointing. I'll use that word again because it just is. COVID has created ongoing and increasing costs for so many people with disability, and not just women with disability. It's created costs for women all round. And to provide just two $250 one-off payments is just a joke, really. It's completely, I don't know, it's laughable for people, for example, who are on the DSP, the disability support pension, who already missed out on the COVID supplement that was provided to people on other support payments. But on top of that, it completely ignores the fact that support payments, and that includes disability support, as well as job seeker, as well as youth allowance and New Start, all of the support payments that people are on, allowing people to live below the poverty wage, below the poverty line, sorry. And yeah, we really needed a permanent increase to that. And again, it's a missed opportunity. That's all I've got to say at the moment. And I'm sorry, I'm a bit, I'm not talking very well. I've had to talk a lot today, and I'm a pretty introverted person, so it's getting a bit hard, but.
Thank you so much for that, Heidi. I think we've got, I'm just checking the time here, we've probably got about 15 minutes for the Q&A left. I just want to thank you all for those really thoughtful contributions, and for bringing some of your personal experiences here today as well. Thank you. I'm aware that the words disappointed and missed opportunity, as I said earlier, have come up very often. So I just want to transition to a little bit of a conversation around hope. So I always, when the pandemic hit again, I returned to rereading Rebecca Solnit, who I absolutely adore, in her book, Hope in the Dark. And there's always this quote in there that hope isn't a lottery ticket that you sit in the in the dark clutching. It's an axe that you use to smash down the door in an emergency. And that's one of my favorite quotes, and that's something that I really cling to. And I personally was really grateful when the pandemic hit to get the grant from the Judith Neilson Institute to do this series for Women's Agenda, because I felt like it really gave me a focus and a sense of purpose at a really mission critical time. And we are at a mission critical time. So if I could just throw out to you, because we did have such a fierce feminist response to this budget within hours. You know, we had a member of the Prime Minister's office calling a journalist and saying that no one credible was making the argument that the budget didn't deliver for women. Clearly, based on everything that you've said here tonight, that's not the case, and a lot of people share that opinion. How do you maintain a sense of hope, a sense of urgency, given the disappointment, and how do we move forward personally? Like, where do you find the gas in your tank, and what are some of the things that you think you personally, we collectively, very important to say the word collectively, can be doing as we move forward? And maybe I'll just throw over to you first, Molly, if you have some thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kristine. Where do I find hope? I think particularly during the bushfires and COVID-19, I found hope in the communities that I belong to. So I would say I find hope in community. And I think for a lot of us, you know, we realized that a lot of the decisions made by government were never going to benefit us. So we kind of, we relied on each other, and I think we were able to distribute our wealth and resources amongst ourselves really, really well to support each other. And I think that kind of definitely inspired a lot of people that I know to be like, wow, shit, things can be different. Like, it doesn't have to be this way, you know? We don't have to sit down and keep copying these horrible budgets or these horrible decisions again and again. So what I think people should do is definitely get involved in their local communities and get involved in local grassroots campaigns, whether it is like the Raise the Rate campaign, you know, people who are really passionate about raising income support to a livable wage, or whether it is getting involved in kind of grassroots feminist organizations, fighting for funding for these specialist services, you know, like maybe you can get involved with your local women's shelter or hop on the board and, like, you know, contribute to that kind of momentum in fighting for funding and resourcing for these really critical community services. But yeah, I think I do still find hope. And I think, that comes from community. So that is my response, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Molly. Emma, did you want to speak to that topic and some of the things that we can do individually and collectively? Sorry, we've just lost you, Emma. So I think I'll move to Heidi and then I'll come back to you. Heidi?
Sure, no worries. I guess in terms of silver linings, one thing that I've noticed within, I guess, COVID and people being at home a lot more and struggling is that I think people have become much more politically aware. And of course, within the circles that we're talking in, and probably the people attending this webinar are all very politically aware and always were. But the general population seems to be a bit more critical and engaging a bit more in social justice. I'm not sure if that's just from what I'm seeing, but it's just how it appears to be. I guess in terms of what people can do, I would agree with Marley in terms of getting involved in community groups, running for parliament if you want to. I know not many people probably want to, but attending a protest, sharing things on social media, there's all sorts of ways people can be politically active. And I think there is a lot of organising happening at the moment, although I suppose COVID has made it difficult to do in-person organising to an extent. It has really escalated online communities and brought people together in different ways, I think. So yeah, there are lots of ways to get involved, and I think whatever way works for you, that's great.
Thanks, Heidi. Emma, did we have you back?
We do. That was very dramatic. Just as I unmuted to answer your question, there was this massive lightning crash out my window and internet connection was lost momentarily. It was hilarious.
All right.
Which just goes to show you just never know what 2020 is going to throw at you next. But look, on hope, one of the things that I have really learned a lot about this year is the difference between hope and optimism. And I think I used to make the mistake of running on optimism far too much and not enough on hope. So optimism is that, that belief that it's going to be okay and things are going to turn out well. And sometimes all the evidence is pointing to, well, perhaps this government is not going to deliver the federal budget that we needed it to this year. Evidence from their past budgets has not led me to think that they would suddenly make a massive investment in things like mental health and social housing and valuing care work and all of those things. But we can still work on hope, because hope is is knowing that even when the rain is pouring down outside, it's nourishing the seeds that are going to blossom into something beautiful. And it's knowing that even if our federal government currently doesn't understand what we're talking about when we're telling them what we need, that we know that we've got the evidence to back up what we're saying, and it comes from the heart. You know, hope is something that comes from deep inside us and just never gives up. And so if we want to really nurture that hope, I think, you know, finding the people that we can work collectively with so that we're not doing these things on our own. It's always better to do these things collectively with a group of people who share the same values and beliefs and concerns that you do. Because the truth of the matter is that there are more of us that care about these things than we might expect. And they're waiting out there, just waiting for us to say, hey, do you want to join me in this? I'm working to try and create a better world for all of us, and let's do it together. We all want to be part of that. And the other thing that's really important is to celebrate the little wins along the way. We may not get everything that we want tomorrow, but if we can get another step closer and another step closer, before you know it, we will have made it. And we can do that together. And it's such a good feeling when we achieve things that can help us to keep going.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emma. What a wonderful observation. I think that really connects to me. That's why I always loved that Solnit quote. It's because it's the difference between optimism and hope, really, isn't it? Hope, she turns hope into an active word. It's an axe that you use to smash down that door in an emergency, and that puts the onus on us not to be passive but to be active. That's why I always cling to that. And I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that I've noticed even in the past few weeks since the budget came out is that there is a lot of momentum and people are making those connections. So anyone out there watching, you know, reach out to your community, as Molly said, reach out beyond your community. You'll find common cause with many people. There's a lot of individuals who are concerned about these diverse issues, and I think that we're increasingly coming together and making our voices heard and doing it very effectively. I think I'm just checking the time. We're sort of reaching the end of this session. I just want to thank everyone who's out there watching for joining us tonight, particularly the folks in Melbourne. I might not be able to help myself enough to take my new haircut out for a drink in the real world. And all of you are contributors and panelists tonight. It's been a really inspiring and excellent and thought-provoking conversation. I think I'm just going to hand back to Helen now, who's going to farewell us.
I am indeed. And I'd just like to, again, thank all of our panellists and Kristine too, because that was a really insightful and I think really useful dissection of some of the issues that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. One of the things that can be really hard about dealing with the budget is the sheer enormity of the scale of a federal budget. And what I loved about that was the way we managed to slice down into particular areas to make that point that Emma made early on about how the budget does affect everybody's lives and in so many different ways. So thank you to all of you for your insights and for your eloquence tonight. Thanks also to Kristine for keeping us fabulously on time. I'd just like to throw across to Bobby from YWCA Australia, who's got some comments about some practical next steps that you might like to engage in if this area is really starting to fire you.
As a host on this meeting, everyone, I'm that shadowy voice that turns into a voiceover. I think the panel tonight has been amazing. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and all of your insights. And I think what's come through really strong and clear is that learning more about the budget and getting stuck in is a really great way to take back some power and act. And there's a really clear message of support for intersectional and gender responsive budgeting. In terms of with the data that we have, and the information that we have, it can be frustrating for a lot of us that work in the sector because we know that money can be directed to those that need it most. And you can do that while stimulating the Australian economy. So it just makes sense to do things differently. And really it comes down to the will of decision makers and politicians for amplifying what we want to do. YWCA Australia want to continue to build that momentum, especially around understanding around intersectional and gender responsive budgeting, and make that information more accessible and easier to advocate simply for those types of things. If you haven't seen or shared our budget explainer video, it's up on the YWCA Australia YouTube channel. And it's a really great way to sort of break down some barriers about learning a bit more about the budget. And we'd like you to watch this space for a short animation coming up, which is going to be exploring intersectional and gender responsive budgeting and really starting to build the dialogue, especially with young people, about how this is just a better way to do things. I hope you all have a lovely evening, and again, celebrations for anyone joining us from Melbourne. We are very excited to lift the border with you, and I hope everybody is safe and well, and hopefully you'll see us very shortly with some more of these really great deep dives into topics. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Bobby. At the last moment, the mute got me. Just one last thing I'd like to let you know about is the National Foundation of Australian Women every year produce the gender analysis of the budget. And I think all three of our panellists may have been involved in writing parts of that this year. And so I would strongly recommend that if you're interested in more information, in more detail about the budget, and in particular about those issues about structural inequality, log on to the National Foundation of Australian Women's website and find the gender analysis page and check out that website. It's a fabulous resource. Thanks very much for your time, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure. We will be popping this recording up on both the ERA and YWCA channels. So if you, one of the first things you could do is let other people know that they should log in and have a look. And thank you again for your time. Cheers.